I want to tell you something. Sometimes I get so focused on something that I can't see much else. A little while ago, I decided that I would go in this thing called a fondo. It's a bike ride. Some people did different distances. I choose the middle ground, 105 kilometers, and I got focused on this. So I started training for this, doing a lot of rides. And I will note that some of my friends called it a race. It wasn't a race. It was a bunch of middle-aged men in a ride together. But it was a bunch of middle-aged men in Lycra called mammals. That's the mammals. In a bike ride they called a race. I trained for this, though. It was a great day. It was in Creston, and I rode hard. I did my best, and I knew that race was coming to an end. But I was so focused, I actually I went right past the finish line. And we had these timers on that you had to cross the finish line for the time to stop. My time did not stop. And people are yelling at me, "You have to cross the finish line!" So since it's a race, I turned around as fast as I could and crossed the finish line. I was so focused on the ride itself that I missed part of the picture, the most important thing. I didn't see it. You know, I think as we continue in the book of Ruth, I think it's really important to see that God is moving in the book of Ruth, and the characters don't see it because they are so focused on their situation. They can't see it. And I feel like it's a bit like us, that when we're in situations, often we can't see what God is doing until we look back. It's hard to see until we look back. So as I was preparing for this message, I thought, what would it be like for me to look back a bit? Just to do some reminiscing. So I actually found this. This is a journal that I have. I used to do this a lot. I don't do this much anymore, so I blew the dust off this thing and thought I would check it out and see what's in here. It's not a diary, it's a journal. Okay, it's a diary, whatever. So I started flipping through this thing. And it's like, oh, this is really interesting. Here's where I'm going to start seminary. And you know what seminary is? It's the place where you go to do like Bible training and learn dead languages and stuff. It's pretty cool. So I was really excited about that. And I actually think I had these dreams and ambitions about what it was going to be like. I was going to go there, and I was probably going to hang out with J.I. Packer in the cafe. And we were going to talk about jazz and comic books. J.I. Packer is a famous theologian. You might not know him. And Eugene Peterson, like maybe we would just sit down and go over the Psalms together in Hebrew. It's going to be amazing. And church life. Well, that's going to be a thing where I just like spread my wings and fly. Maybe I'll get discovered. Oh, it's going to be so amazing. You know, but as I looked through this, I realized that it didn't turn out that way, as a lot of things do. There was a lot of disappointment in that journey. There's a lot of times that were difficult for me. School was not quite what I thought it would be. There's a lot of things I struggled with. And maybe some of you know this secret that we don't share often. I just felt kind of out of place. Like maybe I wasn't smart enough to be there. That was a difficult journey. Church was a difficult journey. It didn't work out the way we thought it would. We felt alone. There were hurts along the way, and we had no money. It was a very difficult time, and I remember feeling like I don't see God in this. This is a complete waste of time. What's the point? Why am I doing this? Well, looking back, though, it's interesting. When I look back in this diary, I see that God was actually preparing me for ministry through some difficult things that I had to go through. And I couldn't see it at the time. And the biggest surprise of this journey is that I can see God moving in my life through the pain of the past. You might relate to that journey. God moved the most in my life when I thought he wasn't there. It's a very strange thing. God was working when I thought I was alone. And I think in the mystery of God moving and the unnoticed and the unseen and working things together, there's a mystery of how he works in our lives. He takes brokenness and knits it together into something good. So as we go through Ruth today, I'm aware that this book has something for all of us, I think. There's something of this for all of us who have ever wondered, where is God in this? Is God mad at me? Has he forgotten about me? Is he even there? Hello? Well, I think this is for us. This is for you, if you've ever been there, because it tells us in those times, God is at work in your life the most. He is there. And he is often at work when we can't see him in those unexpected places, the surprises, the pain, and the margins, and the grief of life. Those are the places he can show up the most. And this book helps us to look at those margins and see and open ourselves up, I think, to seeing God's work in our lives and God's love in our lives in those times we couldn't find it. So it's important to note that the characters in this book don't know that we're reading a book about them 2,000 years later. They had no idea. They didn't know this. They don't see the big picture in the story. We do because we're reading it, but they don't see the big picture. They don't know what's happened generations later, thousands of years later. They have no idea. And this story operates at two levels. There's the big picture of what God is doing, the big picture of redemption, and the small picture of what God is doing. Maybe a small picture of redemption in the characters' lives. There's multiple levels to the story. And God is using ordinary people for his big purposes, and God is present when people feel abandoned. It's a book about where God is when bad things happen. And it's about God working in the margins in his big plan of redemption through ordinary people. And they had no idea this is all happening. So we're reading this from a privileged perspective. Now, this is what happened. The first 5 verses are 5 lifetimes of pain. There is loss, significant loss. First of all, there's a famine. So they leave their homeland, and as refugees, they go to another land, and they settle in as outsiders in this land. A family of 4, Elimelech, the father, Kilian and Mahlon, the sons. And they move to this new land, and they're foreigners in a strange land. It's a reversal, right? Because they're leaving the promised land to a foreign land. Well, they get married. The 2 sons get married. They marry Moabite women. But then things start happening. Elimelech dies. They don't say why. He just dies. And the 2 boys die as well. And Naomi is left alone with Ruth and Orpah, her daughters-in-law, the Moabite women. And I'll note that there's categories in the Old Testament about the people who are the most oppressed and at risk, the most vulnerable. There's 4 categories of this. There is the widow, the poor, the refugee, and the orphan. Now, they're all 4 categories. They're really at risk, vulnerable people. And they're deep in pain. And you also need to know something about this society, because they were right at the margins. All of this Old Testament world was run in a way that we don't understand today in a system called patriarchy. It was very male-dominated. So if you don't have the men in your life, you actually have no power or agency. So the women losing all their men was a total disaster. They were at a complete loss. So they decide to leave and go back to Bethlehem. It must have been a long walk back to Bethlehem in their grief, the three women, trying to see the road through their tears. And they're walking, and Naomi at one point says, "My daughters, it's not good for you to come to Bethlehem. There's nothing here for you." And truly there wasn't. What would there be for women who had been married for 10 years and failed to produce sons? Barren Moabite women. What is there for them in Bethlehem? These are people on the lowest of the margins. There's nothing there for them. She says, "Go back. There's nothing in Bethlehem for you." And they're all grieving together. So Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, decides to go back. And we need to make sure we don't frown on her for heading back. If we were giving advice to people, we would have said, "Go back. There is nothing there." That was the smart decision. To go back to Moab. Maybe something good would happen. The best prospects they could have in Bethlehem were maybe being married and being the third or fourth wife to help around the house. That's it. And that was the best. But this is how Ruth responds. You heard it read earlier. It's a response of surprise that just seems to come from nowhere. It's this outpouring of loyalty and love. She says, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Just seems to bubble up from inside her. This famous passage, one of the actually most theologically dense and significant passages in Scripture, is just expressed in this deep love from the pain. It's like this statement that we need each other at this time. I want to cling to you. I want to draw near while these things are happening. And also, I'm going to draw near to your God. It's quite a statement. I'm going to draw near to you. I'm going to draw near to your God. So instead of moving away in her pain, Ruth moves towards God and Naomi in her pain and grief. That wasn't really the smart decision, but it was the best decision. I'll follow you, and I will follow your God. There's a theme throughout the book of Ruth. It's called hesed. It's this biblical word that's a really deep, profound word for love, and we don't translate it very well. We usually just say kind or nice or likable or something. But hesed is actually much deeper than that. It runs through Ruth, right through it. It's only mentioned 3 times, the word itself, in the book of Ruth. But is the deep theme of the whole book of Ruth. And hesed is this idea of overwhelming love that goes well beyond what is necessary and asked for. It's way beyond. It's extreme. This is what Ruth displays, this hesed love. This is way beyond what was necessary, this expression of love. And I'll note that this is, in Ruth, and I think this is important, this is the opposite of the letter of the law, but represents the spirit of the law. The letter of the law in the Bible and in Ruth is when you do the minimum, the margins, the boundaries, just enough. But the spirit of the law is like hesed. It's this going beyond based on love and going deeper and seeing beyond the margins and the boundaries. That's what Ruth did, and it displays God's heart for us, this hesed love that goes way beyond what's necessary, way beyond the margins. So I was reading this, it reminded me of this really weird parable in Matthew 25 about sheep and goats. Jesus is talking about the Pharisees. It's like this section around the temple where he's confronting Pharisees. And I don't know what's wrong with goats. I don't know why the goats are the bad guys. I mean, I don't know if they're better than sheep. But anyway, they both seem kind of ugly to me. They both produce milk, but one produces sweaters. Maybe that's why. I don't know. Anyway, the sheep and the goats. This is the thing about the sheep and goats. Jesus is teaching them about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And he talks to the sheep, the people who are the sheep, who are on the right side, and says, you're welcome in my kingdom. You'll be with me. And they're like, well, why? I don't even really know why. What did we do? It's like, when you saw the least of these, you gave me a glass of water. What you did to the least of these, you did to me. Now, the goats, the letter of the law people were like, oh, we did everything right. We kept the law. They stayed in the margins. That was the letter of the law. He says, I don't know you, you goats. Jesus turns it around and expands it to this Hesed principle that we go beyond. That's what love does. Loving God and loving others is not about the minimum. It's about going beyond the requirements. So Ruth does this thing with Naomi naturally. It just kind of bubbles out. She doesn't go, well, what does the law say? Okay, what's the minimum I can get away with here? What's my obligation? None of that. This is a bubbling up of Hesed love, the spirit of the law from inside her. And I just think she didn't even see it as this moment where she could be maybe a witness to Naomi in her grief and set her straight, like the people in Job did to Job, right? There's none of that here. It's just an expression of love that came from the inside. Somehow, Naomi also spoke to her. Isn't this a mystery? Why did she convert? Naomi's in this dark, dark place, and Ruth says, I'm going to follow your God. Because sometimes we think we have to do all this stuff, and God is there in the mystery of his work, doing things in people's lives. She didn't follow a program. Ruth draws near to God and Naomi in her grief and brokenness. But Naomi can't see God's work. Ruth's words give a reaction, and the reaction was nothing. Silence. It's kind of like, could we be friends? Could we be best friends? And you turn around. Silence. You send a text message to someone and say, hey, I'm having a birthday party. I'd really like you to come. Here's the date. Here's the time. Only a few people are coming. Just the people I like the best. Message received. No reply. Silence. Or, even worse, you step out and you tell someone you love them. Silence. No reply. Those were awkward, awkward moments, aren't they? When you make yourself vulnerable and nothing happens. And Ruth utters her deepest love, her bravest words of love to Naomi. Silence. Nothing. And I think one of the things here is that when you pour out yourself in Hesed, you have to be prepared for that sort of thing. It's ultimate vulnerability, right? When you take a risk in love, you actually always risk being rejected. It's ultimate vulnerability. When we put ourselves out there and risk, vulnerability isn't just sharing secrets that you think you need to just spit out. That's not really vulnerability. Vulnerability is taking a risk in relationship and love and being brave in things. We offer something, and it's either accepted or rejected, and it takes a lot of courage. So Ruth's statement of love wasn't just a statement, it was also action. She's there walking with Naomi. And she goes as a person with nothing and offers everything that she has. She reaches out and is greeted with silence. That's where Naomi was at. She couldn't see the love because she was in the margins. She couldn't see it. It was love from the margins to the margins. She reacts further. Because we know they arrive in Bethlehem. And it says that the city was excited in some translations. They created quite a stir. And I think we hear excited and think maybe they had like some balloons and fireworks when they came. But I think that's not quite right. I think it's more like when they saw Naomi and Ruth, they wondered, what happened here? This is a train wreck. There's a story here of something really bad happening. They saw Naomi and go, what happened to you? What's the story here? So this is what happens. Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer, and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? Something here is that Naomi's name actually means sweetness. This person, maybe it's a reflection of who she was, but this person was sweet and has now become bitter. It's a complete transformation of who they are because of this pain. From sweet to bitter. Don't call me sweet, call me bitter, because this is now who I am. And the walls go up, they're walls of grief and pain. And that does happen when we're disappointed, when there's hurt and grief. Walls go up and they can change a person. And we can think that bitterness and anger is a strength that we hide behind, because it does make us feel powerful when we're angry and bitter. When we're angry, we don't feel weak. We feel strong. And often when people are really hurt, these are the go-tos, anger and bitterness. They're walls that can be put up because it's terrifying to let go of those things. And it's terrifying, I think, for Naomi to receive love as well, because it's more vulnerability to receive love. She's just lost everything. How can she receive more love? Whenever you love, you risk losing again. And it's easier to hurt someone first than to open yourself up to that love. And you have to trust to let go of bitterness and hate. So Naomi moves away where Ruth draws close to her and God. Naomi puts up walls and moves away, walls herself up. But this is something that we need to hear really carefully and clearly in the book of Ruth. It's okay that she did that. It's okay to be angry with God. It's okay to be in grief. It's okay to be where you're at. The message comes through loud and clear. She is never, ever condemned for being where she's at in this book. It's okay to be where you're at, to be honest. And God is moving in the margins and in the unexpected, even when we can't see it. God is moving. All Ruth has left is presence. There's no more words that can be uttered, just presence. And Ruth decides to stay with Naomi. Ruth's response to silence is presence. Something we need to be mindful of, right? Just the power of presence with people. This is Ruth 1, verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the young Moabite woman. It's funny, isn't it, how this shift in the narrative goes to this. The young Moabite woman. Oh, we didn't know who you were talking about. The young Moabite woman. We got it. It's like we've been reading along. We know who this is. The young Moabite woman. It's a reminder that this person that's accompanied Naomi was on the margins, the very lowest of the low. This person expressing this hesed love that Israel's supposed to express. She's the lowest of the low. This is who's accompanied Naomi back. And God's people are called to be a people of Hesed, that live according to the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. And here is this Moabite woman being the example for all Israel about the spirit of the law when they're stuck in the letter of the law. It's quite a reversal and quite a lesson when the lowest and the most unexpected are the models for us to follow. And Hesed is like this starting point. You know, we want things to be quick, but Hesed starts like a little bit of yeast, and it just gets in and starts expanding. That's how God does his work. The second half of verse 22 says this. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's how the chapter ends. From famine to harvest. It's a pretty interesting way to end. They arrived just in time, and hope is right around the corner. That's a signal for us. Hope is right around the corner. This is a new beginning. You know, we all have our stories of grief and hurt and pain and struggles. And as I was reading this and thinking about my own story and other people's stories, I came across this quote that just really grabbed me. It says, "The sad stories do not have happy endings, but sad stories may yield new beginnings." It's an Old Testament scholar, Phyllis Tribble. It really grabbed me because I think we want to push the grief away and tell people it's okay and to move on. But it's not always like that. See, I think that pain stayed with Naomi the rest of her life. But there was a new beginning that happened. She saw life differently. Maybe through her tears there was wisdom and love and empathy and generosity that wasn't there before because of what she'd been through. She was, and we can be, more of Jesus when we see the world through those eyes of pain and grief and sorrow. Ruth's presence with Naomi is like God's presence with us. It's there even when we don't see it. Don't acknowledge it. So where is God in our lives today? Where is God in your life? Your journey? Past or present? I think what this teaches us is something really important, that God moves in the unexpected and in the hardest times. Right when you think you're at your lowest, that's where God is the strongest. And that was my surprise reading this. Looking back and seeing what God has done in my life through my struggles. And I can now look back and actually see God in my darkest times. It's the mystery of God's work in brokenness. It's where he can do his best work. Jesus was also a person who was on the margins. You ever think of that? Jesus was on the margins. He was poor. He was a minority. He was an oppressed minority, living under occupation. He was in the margins. And hope came to the people from the margins. They didn't see it. Even the disciples didn't actually see it. It's an interesting story about Peter, right? Jesus is preparing for his death and trial. And Jesus says to Peter, you're actually going to turn your back on me. When it gets the hardest, you're going to turn your back on me. And Peter's like, no way. Like, I am, don't you know my name? I'm Petros. I'm the rock. I'm the guy that walks on water. I mean, I sunk a bit. But I do walk on water. I'm the guy. There's no way I will ever betray you. At the darkest time, after Jesus' crucifixion, people ask him, do you know who this guy was? You look like one of his disciples. Nope, don't know the guy. Don't know him. He was so convinced that this was just all a mistake. Did it 3 times. Yet after the death, after the grief, there was a resurrection. It was a new beginning, right? For Peter too. And I think what we hear about this in Ruth is that all of us have a small story and a part in the big story. And we don't know what the part in the big story is. Maybe there will be a book of Dan one day. Book of Adrian. Probably not. But just trying to be nice. We don't know our part in God's big story of redemption. And these are people that were on the margins that God used in mighty ways. We have our own stories. And God's working in our lives too, in our small stories. And I think the thing to take away from this today is that God moves in unexpected ways on the margins when we feel he's not near. That's when he does his best work. It's the mystery of God moving in the unexpected and brokenness. It's who Jesus is. He moves in the unexpected and brokenness from the margins into the margins. And here's the thing. God's moving doesn't depend on our seeing. He does it anyway. God is at work in the margins of life. Look and see.